This conference will now be recorded.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our January TAC meeting. We have a nice lineup this morning. We have 41 currently on the call. I'm Aaron Brown. I am the co-chair along with Kelly Levy, who is not able to be with us today. We haven't been going around and doing introductions. I think we'll probably stick to that just for the sake of bandwidth and time and everything else. What I would like to request as everyone is presenting is to please make sure that you are muted. And probably if you're not actively asking a question, it wouldn't be a bad idea to turn off your camera just for the sake of bandwidth. At least on my end, that seems to help out the least number of cameras that we currently have running at the same time. So Maya, do we have any information that we need to address before we get started this morning?
I don't think so. I think we can dive right in.
All right, sounds great. Well, I'm glad everybody saw the email that Maya sent out with our updated link this morning. So it looks like we're doing great there. Our first presenter this morning is Kim, and Kim, I apologize if I mispronounced your last name. Halsworth, is that correct?
Hey, that's good.
Yes, starting off on a high note. From SwiftMud, who will be presenting on the status of MFLs for Little Manatee River. So Kim, whenever you are ready, I'm going to turn off my camera. You can take it away.
Great. Good morning, everybody. Can everybody hear me and see my presentation, first of all?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Well, thanks for the opportunity to talk to you this morning, and I appreciate the invitation. I'm a senior environmental scientist with the district, and I'm the technical lead for the Little Manatee River minimum flows development. And today I'm going to provide an overview of the status of the minimum flows development. And I'll probably say it, you'll probably get sick of me saying it, but we're in the middle of the peer review process right now. So a lot of the stuff that I will be presenting is draft information, but at least it'll give you an idea on where we are right now. So now I'm seeing if my slide changes. You see in the next slide?
Yes.
Good. It went to sleep or something. So I'm sure most of you know where the Little Manatee River is located, but just in case, it's in the southern part of Hillsborough County and the northern part of Manatee County. It flows west from its headwaters, which are located east of Fort Lonesome, and then it empties into Tampa Bay near Ruskin. The Little Manatee River is one of the most pristine blackwater rivers in Southwest Florida, and is the only tidal river designated as an outstanding Florida water by the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, largely due to its relatively natural state. If you are a kayaker and haven't had the opportunity, this is a great river to kayak. The river flows west for about 4.5 miles through Little Manatee River State Park. And from US Highway 301 to Tampa Bay, it flows through Cockroach Bay Aquatic Preserve. In the eastern part of the watershed, agricultural land uses increased from the 1970s through the 1990s, but have been declining. And urbanization, as well as phosphate mine lands, have continually increased in the eastern part of the watershed since the 1970s. Minimum flows are required by state law to be established for flowing systems in our district, if you're wondering why we're doing this. The legal definition of a minimum flow is the limit at which further withdrawals would be significantly harmful to the water resources or ecology of the area. In other words, minimum flows protect flowing systems from significant harm. And significant harm is not specifically defined in the law. And I will get to that in a minute on how we determine what significant harm is. And minimum flows are established to protect these systems from impacts resulting from ground and surface water withdrawals. Minimum flows must be developed using the best information available. and they are one of the tools that the district uses to protect water resources. We use them in our regulatory programs when applications come in for surface and groundwater withdrawal requests, and they're used for water supply planning. And as I mentioned earlier, significant harm is not defined in the state law. It's up to us to define what that means. And for most habitats and resources, the response to changes in flow is continuous, which makes it very difficult to define the limit at which harm occurs. The district defines significant harm as more than a 15% decrease in an available habitat or resource, or conversely as protecting 85% of the available habitat or resource. And this threshold isn't arbitrary. It's based on a suggestion of an independent peer review panel starting around 2002. And since then, more than 20 panels of independent scientists that have reviewed minimum flows proposed for flowing systems in our district have been supportive of this approach. And minimum flows using this threshold have been adopted for quite a number of other outstanding Florida waters in our district. And this threshold, or very similar thresholds, are used in minimum flows development throughout the world. Listed here on the slide are the 10 environmental values that are listed in the state statute that must be considered when minimum flows are developed. Some of them are easier to evaluate than others. Some of them also overlap with other environmental values. For example, fish and wildlife habitats and the passage of fish, those are environmental values that we can evaluate directly. Some of these environmental values are functions or processes, such as the transfer of detrital material and filtration and absorption of nutrients and other pollutants. And those environmental values have to be evaluated indirectly. And one assumption is that if you protect the habitat that performs the function or the process, then you can assume that that function or process is protected. So for the purposes of minimum flows development, the freshwater portion, or the upper Little Manatee River, starts at the headwaters near Fort Lonesome in southeastern Hillsborough County and extends to the Highway 301 bridge. I don't know if you can see my pointer. There's a USGS gauge located there, and that's represented by the green triangle, and that's the USGS gauge that the minimum flows will be established at, and the location of where we are using the flow record to develop the baseline flow, which I'll talk about in a second. The estuarine portion, or the lower Little Manatee River, again, for the purpose of minimum flows development, starts at the US Highway 301 bridge and ends where the river flows into Tampa Bay. So there's one main surface water withdrawal from this river, which is represented by this yellow dot of Florida Power and Light, which draws water from the river to maintain this reservoir, this large reservoir here, associated with their Manatee Power Plant. They've been reducing their withdrawals over the years due to changes in their operations. Development of minimum flows for the lower river has been ongoing for a number of years. Work was conducted on and off since the late 1990s, and minimum flows development did not move forward due to other priorities. The first draft report for the lower river was not prepared until 2018, and the report summarized all the earlier work and updated it where appropriate. It included analyses using the original hydrodynamic model that was developed in 2007, which is based on bathymetry data collected even earlier. The draft report also included some new analyses. So from 2019 through late last year, the original hydrodynamic model was enhanced, and all the analysis included in the draft 2018 report were updated. And throughout this process, we carried forward the old work and performed enhancements and improvements where we could. Development of minimum flows for the upper Little Manatee River has also been going on for a number of years, since the early 2000s. A draft report summarizing the analyses and the recommended minimum flows was completed in late 2011, and it was reviewed by a panel of independent scientists in 2012. The peer review panel had substantial comments, and these are the main ones that are listed in this in the bullets. The proposed minimum flows were appropriate and reasonable, but the peer review panel stated that they were not as rigorous as they would have preferred, mainly because the in-stream habitat analysis was based on only 2 sites in the river. There was also a lack of biological data, so they stated that the data that was used was minimally adequate. They recommended switching from calendar-based blocks to flow-based blocks, and I'll talk about that in a second. They recommended conducting a sediment transport analysis, and they recommended evaluating different benchmark flow periods. In this draft report, the flow record before 1970 was evaluated as well as after. So because of the substantial peer review comments that were received in 2012, as well as other priorities, the district did not move forward with developing minimum flows at that time. We picked the work back up again in 2016, and we've been working on it pretty much since then. Additional work was conducted. We addressed all of the peer review comments that I just mentioned in the last slide. Also, since the peer review panel had no concerns with the HECRAS model that was developed, the decision was made to use the original model developed in 2010 with some enhancements. So the earlier work was updated and additional analyses were conducted. So a draft report was completed late last year, summarizing all the work that I just mentioned. We developed one report for both the upper and the lower river. There's a draft set of minimum flows for both the upper and the lower river included in the report. And we began the independent scientific peer review process last September, and we're in the middle of that now. In October and November, we held a number of public meetings with the peer review panel, and they have submitted their draft set of comments and recommendations. And because the comments are substantial, mostly related to the modeling work, we've extended the peer review period to allow us to work with the peer reviewers and conduct additional work to address their comments and concerns. We appreciate the involvement of many, including a lot of you that are listening in today, during the peer review process and the comments that we have received to date. All of the comments that we have received so far will be considered as we move forward, as well as comments that we receive in the future as we move forward in the process. So one thing we need to develop minimum flows is a baseline flow record. And baseline flows are, or natural flows as they are often called, those are flows that would have occurred in the absence of withdrawals. So we use the long-term flow record that started in 1939, at the USGS gauge at Highway 301 bridge that I showed you earlier to develop the baseline flow record. The daily surface water withdrawals from the river from Florida Power and Light since 1976 were added to the record, and flows from the agricultural return since 1977 were subtracted. Note that this agricultural return water also includes flow that is discharged occasionally from a permitted phosphate mine outfall way up in the upper headwaters in a creek called Alderman Creek. And I also wanted to mention, because the Little Manatee River is located in an area of high confinement, geologically speaking, impacts from groundwater withdrawals are not an issue for the Little Manatee River. Since river flows typically vary seasonally, the district develops minimum flows using seasonal blocks. And this allows for the evaluation of changes in habitat, environmental values, or resources of concern due to reductions in flow during critical low and high flow periods. Block 1 represents dry season flows Block 2 represents medium flows, and then Block 3 is the wet season or high flows. In the past, the district used calendar-based blocks to develop minimum flows, including the earlier work for the Little Manatee. But as I mentioned earlier, the first peer review for the upper Little Manatee River work, they recommended using flow-based blocks over calendar blocks. So that's what we're doing now. That reduces the unintended impacts on biological communities in years where the flows are now not well matched to the fixed start and end dates of the calendar-based blocks. Here's just an example of how they're developed. These are the draft flow-based blocks, and I want to mention these are draft. We're working on this now, so the numbers most likely will change. That were developed for the Upper Little Manatee, and each system is unique. And for the Upper Little Manatee River, they were developed based on the resources of concern for the upper river. And we use the same flow-based blocks to develop minimum flows for both the upper and the lower river. These flow-based blocks are draft, as I mentioned, so I wouldn't be too concerned about what the numbers are right now because they are likely to change. The district uses a percent of flow approach to develop minimum flows for flowing systems, and this approach maintains the natural flow regime or the natural variation, which is important for the health and the maintenance of the river system. Therefore, the criteria for all the resources of concern that were evaluated to develop minimum flows for both the upper and the lower river is the percentage that flow can be reduced without reducing the availability of the habitat or resource by more than 15%. Or protecting 15 or 85% of the available habitat or resource. The district's approach to developing minimum flows is habitat-based, and we evaluated different types of important habitats in the upper Little Manatee River that are used by fish and wildlife. These habitats also provide many important functions for the ecosystem and people, including many that are listed in the environmental value slide that I showed you earlier, that we must consider when we develop minimum flows. So if you protect the habitat, as I've mentioned, the function that the habitat provides are also protected. And for the upper Little Manatee River, the resources of concern that we evaluated included habitat in the water or in-stream habitat and floodplain wetlands habitat. In-stream habitat was evaluated for block 1 and 2 flows. If you remember, that's low and medium flows. And inundated floodplain habitat was evaluated for block 3 flows. We determined the amount of habitat available under natural or baseline conditions, that is, conditions that would occur in the absence of withdrawals, and then we assessed what would happen if the flow in the river was reduced by withdrawals. Changes in in-stream habitat availability were evaluated using something called the System for Environmental Flow Analysis, or SEFA. This methodology is replaced something called the PHAB-SIM, which was used earlier to evaluate the changes in available in-stream habitat due to withdrawals. We collected substrate and cover data in the field. The depth and the velocity was determined using the original HECRAS model that we developed for the river in 2010 that was enhanced. We did our work at 7 sites, 3 cross sections at each site, so that's 21 cross sections. And if you recall from an earlier slide, the peer review panel was concerned about the use of only 2 sites in the past, so we increased our sample size of the sites. And there's 25 functional or taxonomic groups that we looked at, different life stages of fish, different guilds of fishes, as well as benthic macroinvertebrates. We looked at changes in the inundated floodplain wetlands habitat using a spatial analysis, using something called HEC-GeoRAS, which is a add-on to the HEC-RAS model. And again, we used the 2010 HEC-RAS model that was enhanced to look at changes in inundated floodplain wetlands habitat at the high flows. Again, the district's approach to developing minimum flows is habitat-based, and the resources of concern, or the habitats that we evaluated for minimum flows development for the lower river, included biologically relevant salinity zones and estuarine fish habitat. And we evaluated both of these available habitat types for all flow-based blocks. And again, just as a reminder, we determined the amount of habitat available under natural or baseline conditions, and then we assess what would happen if the flow in the river was reduced by withdrawals. Low salinity habitat was evaluated for all flow-based blocks using the original EFDC. It's the Environmental Fluid Dynamics Code hydrodynamic model developed for the lower river in 2007 that we enhanced. We evaluated changes in salinity habitat from 0 to 30 PSU, but we are focused on protecting the low salinity habitat, which is 2 PSU or less. Available estuarine fish habitat, more specifically favorable habitat for occupancy, was evaluated for all flow blocks for a number of fish using something called an environmental favorability function analysis. This method is used extensively in conservation biogeography. It's been used in Tampa Bay to evaluate effects of the lower Alafaya River flows on fish occurrence, as well as to evaluate effects of management scenarios on fish occurrence in Old Tampa Bay. And fish species that had a higher probability of occurrence at lower or mid-range salinities were considered to be the most useful, such as mohaira, mosquito fish, sailfin molly, hog choker, and a number of gobies. We also developed a low flow threshold to limit surface water withdrawals at low flows. And the criteria we use to develop the low flow threshold includes wetted perimeter, or the portion of wet stream bottom and banks, and fish passage. Originally, we planned to propose a low flow threshold for just the upper river. However, additional work that we've done in the last couple of years demonstrated that it protected the lower river as well. So the proposed low flow threshold is for both the upper and the lower river. So now I'm going to run through the results really quick, and I just want to mention these are draft results. So the numbers that I'm showing you will most likely change as we get through the peer review process. So I'm not going to, focus on the numbers too much, but for block 1 and block 2 flows, again, the draft results for block 1 flows, the most sensitive group using the CIFA analysis was the deep fast habitat guild, and the most sensitive group for the medium flows is the mayfly caddisfly group. And it just, again, the draft results for block 1, the 15% loss in the available habitat occurs at flow reductions greater than 10%. And then it occurs in block 2 at flow reductions greater than 20%. Again, these are draft results. So for inundated floodplain wetlands, for the high flows, again, we're looking at block 3 flows only. At flows greater than 72 CFS, the 15% loss of inundated floodplain wetland acreage occurs at baseline flow reductions greater than 13%. And then there's some higher elevation floodplain wetlands that are a little bit more sensitive. So the 15% loss occurs at baseline flow reductions greater than 11%. Again, don't focus too much on these numbers because they're draft results and are likely to change. But here they are all together. Again, these are draft numbers. One thing I want to mention that I mentioned earlier, the minimum flows for the upper Little Manatee River will be established at the USGS gauge at the Highway 301 bridge. And then again, these are the draft proposed minimum flows that I just showed you earlier. And just for an example, for block 1, the 15% loss in the available habitat for the deep fast habitat gilded fish occurs at greater than 10% of the flow, reduction in flow. So the proposed minimum flow is 90% of the flow on the previous day. Again, I'm not going to go through all the detail on these numbers. These are in a draft report right now, but they'll most likely change after the peer review process. And for the lower river, we use the hydrodynamic model for all flow-based blocks to look at changes in the low salinity habitat. And you can see here's the draft numbers right now. The 15% loss in the low salinity habitat occurs at baseline flow reductions greater than 14% for block 1, greater than 27% for block 2, and greater than 40% for block 3. Again, these are draft numbers, most likely to change. For looking at estuarine fish habitat, for block 1 flows, the 15% loss in favorable habitat occurs at baseline flow reductions greater than 10%, block 2 greater than 20%, and block 3 greater than 30%. And these numbers are a bit more sensitive than the results using the hydrodynamic model for the low salinity habitat. So right now, the draft minimum flows for the lower Little Manatee River are based on the results looking at protecting favorable estuarine fish habitat. Again, the minimum flows for the lower Little Manatee River will also be established at the Highway 301 Bridge USGS gauge. And then again, these are the draft numbers for the proposed minimum flows for the lower Manatee River. Here's the flow-based block values right now. Again, all subject to change as we go through the peer review process. The proposed low flow threshold is less than or equal to 35 cubic feet per second. No surface water withdrawals are permitted when flows are at that value or below. Again, at the Highway 301 USGS gauge, again, because we're in the middle of the peer review process, this number could change. So I've probably said it 100 times, but just to let you know where we are now, we're in the middle of the peer review process. We're currently conducting additional modeling work to address the comments of the peer review panel. We're also taking a close look at the draft flow-based blocks, and we're considering all the comments that we have received so far, and we will be considering all comments as we go through the process. So if you have comments on our proposed minimum flows, please get them to me so we can consider them through the process. This is our draft schedule right now. It also could be changed, depending how things go through the peer review process, but we're hoping to complete our work to respond to the peer review panel by the end of next month, and then we'll complete the draft response document. And then in the spring, we'll have, some more public meetings, and we'll revise our draft report. We plan to hold a public workshop later this spring during the summer, as well as numerous stakeholder meetings, including, we could come give you guys another presentation, once we get through the peer review process. And then we hope to present the recommended minimum flows to our governing board sometime later this year, and then requesting their approval to begin the rule language process. So thanks again for inviting me to participate, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great, thanks so much, Kim. I have a question. Kim, with the kind of ongoing rapid development that we're seeing down there in southern Hillsborough County and the upper parts of the Little Manatee River watershed, how much of a concern is that going forward into how we look at our MFLs? Or is that, as you mentioned earlier, groundwater withdrawals aren't as large as a player for this system? Is it something that we need to keep an eye on, or is it something that doesn't really play that greatly into our MFL calculations for this particular system?
Well, I guess a couple of things, like you mentioned, because groundwater withdrawals aren't an issue for the Little Manatee River, you know, we don't really need to, that's not something we need to look at. And one thing that is changing that I mentioned in the beginning, instead of, growing, a lot of the agricultural lands are growing houses now or being turned into subdivisions. So that could change the water that's coming in from the agriculture. And then that's something we consider when we're developing the baseline flow record. So I guess as once the minimum flows are developed, every so often we monitor the system every year, and then later down the road, if we reevaluate the minimum flows and then come up with another baseline flow record, to update through time, there might be less agricultural return water included in the baseline flow record because there's more houses.
Gotcha. Gary had a comment in the chat. Gary, did you want to verbalize that, or do you want me to read it off?
Sure. Thanks, Aaron. Within the 2020 Habitat Master Plan update that was approved by our management policy boards, reviewed heavily by the TAC a couple of years ago, one of the primary habitats of concern was low salinity Juncus salt marshes. And Little Manatee River is one of the places that these occur, and we anticipate habitat restoration of these of this important critical habitat. Does the plan address that? How does the plan address that? And this is in the context that the work that we've done, primarily literature background research, indicates that the Juncus marshes will be showing up from 0 to about 18 PSU. And of course, this is in the context of sea level rise and saltwater intrusion. Thanks.
The question you're asking relates to the Tampa Bay Estuary Program Plan, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, that's why I'm being quiet. And I know Maya, you've provided me with that plan, and thanks for sending it. And that's something we'll be looking at as we move forward.
Hey, Kim, this is Doug Leeper. I'll
Hey,
add
Doug.
a little bit more to that response, and that is that when we're evaluating salinity habitat responses, we're looking at different salinity zones from, basically fresh water up to full Gulf strength. So we're looking at changes in a whole range of different salinity zones. And it just so happens the less than 2 was the most sensitive based upon the modeling we've done to date. But that means we've also, I guess what I'm saying is we've looked at, the range of salinity zones that you've just described where Juncus is distributed in the river.
Thanks, Doug. We have another comment in the chat from Natasha Dickrell asking, do you anticipate this report impacting withdrawal permits being granted despite the land use and anticipated increases or distribution of rainfall?
I wish I could read it again.
I'll read it again.
I'm trying to see if I can, I'm trying to get to the chat where I can see it.
It's the second from the bottom right now. If you scroll all the way down from Natasha, and I'll read it again. Do you anticipate this report impacting withdrawal permits being granted despite the land use and anticipated increasing or distribution of rainfall?
So as I mentioned early on, minimum flows are one of the tools that our regulatory program uses when applications come in for permits to withdraw ground and surface water. So it is a tool that the regulatory program uses. The second thing relates to rainfall. And yes, that is considered. But the base, we use the baseline flow record to develop the minimum flows. I don't know if that answered your question, but yes, rainfall is a factor. Of course, it influences things. But as I mentioned,
Hey, this is
I
Ron.
also mentioned, yeah, thanks, Ron, about the groundwater withdrawals are an impact in this area.
Yeah, this is Ron Basso, Chief Hydrogeologist here at the district. We don't anticipate anything happening with groundwater withdrawal permits, in relation to this minimum flow level at the Little Manatee, because the system is tightly confined, by 200 to 300 feet of clay from the surface on down. However, we do have a most impacted area associated with our southern water use caution area that's related to saltwater intrusion within the upper Florida aquifer, and that's been ongoing, That's been ongoing for the last 20 years. We haven't issued any permits in that most impacted area. And then we have a series of saltwater intrusion minimum aquifer levels obviously established in that area too, and those are not met. So there are, conditions for groundwater permits independent of this minimum flow and level, that people have to be, required to deal with. But as far as this minimum flow level, this would just be applicable to any future surface water withdrawals on the river system.
I think the common thread between this question and Gary's question is, I think the district does a really nice job of accounting for anthropogenic impacts associated with water withdrawals, but there's this other anthropogenic impact associated with a changing climate. And so that affects sea level rise, rainfall patterns. And I think that the TAC is trying to understand how those kinds of concerns may or may not be incorporated into the rule and the way that it's applied at the district.
We had one last question. Oh,
this
sorry.
Is Doug Leeper. This is Doug Leeper, Minimum Flows and Levels Program Lead. I'll kind of respond to that. So the best we can do, and the best that we currently do with the technology and knowledge that we have, is when we're working on coastal system minimum flows and levels, we take into account right up front in our analyses a look at our projections associated with various sea level rise, future sea level rise conditions. We use that information to kind of give us some indication of what we might expect the system to look like in the future under the various predicted sea level changes, and consider that information as an initial look at a future need for a reevaluation of a minimum flow level. We establish minimum flows and levels. We don't walk away from them. We're monitoring their status every year and every 5 years as part of our regional water supply planning process. And in that longer term look, we have to think about things like you've mentioned, like sea level change and how that can influence the baseline conditions in an estuary. So it's something we look at right up front, and it's something we keep our eye on as we implement minimum flows and levels and make determinations about whether they're met, not being met, whether they need to be reevaluated, and when. So hopefully that helps a little bit.
Thanks, Doug.
Aaron?
I was just going to say that we do have one more comment in the chat there.
I got a comment too, Aaron, after get through all the tech. No, go through the tech comments first. No.
All right. From Daniel Simpson, Kim wanted to know if you looked at manatees. If so, is there any thermal refuge connected with the power plant?
We did not look at manatees. The power plant withdraws water from the river that goes into that reservoir. And so the manatees couldn't get there. And there is some manatee use in the estuary, but because the Little Manatee River is so shallow, they don't get very far up the river. So that's not a criteria we looked at. There is kind of a summary in the draft report of the manatee use in that area, but we didn't look at them for it's making sure we're protecting thermal refuge because there's not really much in that river.
Gotcha, thank you. Ed, do you want to go ahead?
Was there any other TAC comments before I go through
I
mine?
don't believe so. Oh, nope, sorry. Nope, we're good.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Kim, Ron, and Doug for making this presentation again to our technical advisory committee. I know this has been going through the peer review process, and you guys have been presenting at the Water Management District's Environmental Advisory Committee. So I appreciate the district's openness to receive input throughout the process of developing this MFL. And it sounds, pretty positive in terms of where you guys are at in terms of hearing some of the comments so far, especially related to the flow-based blocks. I know that was one of the initial concerns in terms of applying the upper Little Manatee River thresholds to the lower estuary and not doing more refined analyses in the estuaries to understand where those low, medium, and high flow thresholds should be applied for the estuarine portions of the river. So it sounds like you guys are being responsive to that and working on that. So I just want to say I appreciate that. And I also want to just mention and reiterate some comments I made back in December related primarily to the medium flow-based block, whatever it ends up being. I think some of the analysis that were presented in the appendices of the MFL report indicate, that the 20% flow reduction might not be as protective for some species of the estuarine-dependent species in the estuarine portion of the river. So I'd encourage the district to look at some of the individual species responses, especially for like menhaden, blue crab, commercially and recreationally important species, as well as some of the resident species where a slightly lower flow reduction, especially during that medium flow-based block, might be more appropriate, especially as we talk about protecting this outstanding Florida water and hopefully a federally recognized wild and scenic river at some point in the future. So erring on the side of caution, being more protective, especially during those intermediary flows that often occur during the spring and fall recruitment periods for a lot of estuarine-dependent species. So just being sensitive to some of those individual species environmental favorability function analyses that were presented in the MFL reports, and being a little bit more protective in terms of the flow reductions during those medium, and I know you have the low flow threshold. So just wanted to make those comments, reiterate some of what I mentioned at the December peer review meeting. I know you've received a lot of comments so far, so just wanted to again pose that to y'all and just make sure that's on your radar as well. So again, I wanted to express my appreciation for the district continuing to be open to receive these comments from the community on this important MFL.
And I echo those thoughts, and I just want everyone to be aware. I put a couple of links in the chat. One is just to remind everyone that the reason that we're talking about this here at this forum is that it is one of the actions in our CCMP, and so I provided that link. I also think the district has done a really nice job of sharing all of the peer review information, the reports, and the comments that have been received from the public on a web forum that you can navigate to via the link that I provided above from the district's website. So I'd encourage any of you who are interested in diving a little deeper into this topic to visit the watermatters.org website and look at some of those documents.
Hey, Aaron, this is Tom Ash at EPC. At the risk of turning us into a love fest, I did want to echo again what Ed was saying. We very much appreciate the responsiveness of both the peer review committee and Kim and the rest of the SwiftMud staff on our concerns about the flow blocks, and we appreciate the transparency and the effort to take all of those public comments into consideration and go back and maybe take another bite at the apple and see if we can get this river right. So very much appreciate that, and thanks again for this presentation as well.
Thanks, Tom. I thought we were already a love fest. Is that not where we sit? I I mean, Kim, thank you so much for the presentation. Again, if anyone would like to provide additional feedback, Maya has provided the links there for the proper documentation, and Kim can be reached through the district. So thank you, Kim, and thank you, Ron and Doug, for chiming in as well for that. Next up, we have Marcus Beck, who is going to be presenting on the R-Sparrow loading model and climate data processing tool.
All right, thanks, Aaron. Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Super. All right. So yeah, good morning, everybody. I'm Marcus Beck. I think most everybody knows me at this point. I'm the program scientist for the estuary program here. I have the distinct honor to present an ongoing project to this group that has been going on for the last couple of years now. And full disclosure, my involvement in this project has been like 0.1%. But we at the estuary program are considered end users in this project, as well as those in Sarasota Bay estuary program. And so we're at a point in this project where we want to share what has come out of it to this group to make you all aware of what is available to you as potential end users for these great modeling tools that have come out of this broader project. We'll do slideshow. So my goals today are I actually have a few. I have a few slides where I'm gonna just describe basically some background for this project, what it's all about, what the timeline has been to date, why this project exists, and then I'm going to be talking about some of the details about this modeling tool, how you guys can get your hands on it, what it provides, and in doing so, I'm actually going to go through a demo of the application as it stands to date. That's where I'm hoping most of the demonstrated value will lie in this presentation, really showing you the functionality of the tool, what products you have available to you, and then hopefully emphasize to you all how we can kind of engage you all once these tools are finalized to actually start using these products in our watersheds. As I said, I'm a very small part of this broader project. This is the complete project team to date. Matt Miller is the PI, as well as Dick Smith at USGS, but there's several other folks involved from USRA, NASA, academic partners, and then what we call our end users at the estuary program here, as well as other NEPs and folks from the NERS that are actually having these tools applied to their watersheds as a updated modeling tool for understanding nutrient loads into the systems. So I'm representing this broader group, and we have actually several of the members on this call. So any tough questions about this project, I'll punt to them at the end. But again, I'm representing the broader effort from this team. So this presentation is about R-Sparrow, but how this project came to be is resting on the foundation of the broader Sparrow modeling effort to date. And so, this is obviously one of the more popular modeling tools to come out of USGS over the last couple of decades. There's a long history for this modeling product, but the original tool is called just Sparrow, so spatially referenced regressions on watershed attributes. And basically what this provides to you is essentially a watershed-based model that relates surface water quality measurements to watershed attributes using a series of nonlinear regression equations. I'm not going to go into the details in the modeling components, but what you come up with when the model is calibrated for a watershed is you can get predictions of contaminant flux, concentration, and yields in streams, basically. So you have stream-based predictions of nutrient loads is the primary application of this. And the value of that is you can understand where, what are the loads entering a system, so Tampa Bay, for example. But once you have a fitted model, you can actually run these different hypotheses or testing scenarios to understand what are the different drivers of contaminant sources, or what watershed properties are actually controlling the transport of the different loads into the system. So you can actually run these scenarios to sort of test different questions or different management outcomes that you have for a particular system, and they're obviously valuable tools in that respect. If you go to these websites here, you can find a lot of great resources about the original models. Some of the primary constituents that are modeled through Sparrow are basic geochemical constituents like stream flow, salinity, nitrogen and phosphorus as primary limiting nutrients for coastal systems or estuary systems are very popular ones. And actually the models we have for Tampa Bay and Sarasota Bay are focusing on phosphorus as the primary nutrient entering these systems. I believe nitrogen models are in the works, so that'll be coming down the pipeline as well. Fecal indicators, pathogens are also modeled. So, looking forward, these are all things that could be included in the next iteration of our Sparrow. So why this project came to exist is obviously, Sparrow is a very popular modeling tool, as I just described. The methods were developed in the 90s, and the initial model was released by USGS in 2006. Now, it is a great tool, but there are some limitations that were meant to be addressed in this next iteration of the project that I'm talking about today. The original model basically was calibrated to a particular time period, so there's not really a whole lot of forecasting you can do with the original model. And on top of that, you don't have the ability to get seasonal estimates of the different flux and load concentrations into the system. So this latest iteration is meant to provide those two services. So we have forecasting capabilities, and we have what we're calling a dynamic version of the model that provides you those seasonal estimates in addition to the annual estimates that you get from the traditional model. The original one also relied on SAS code, which was a lot more popular back in the day. Not as much anymore with the advent of more open source tools. So this latest iteration of the model is meant to migrate the Sparrow tools from proprietary software like SAS to an open source platform using R as a vehicle to make the tools more open, exposing the source code and putting them online through version control. The other limitation of the original Sparrow model was there was basically what we're calling limited decision support systems. So interactive platforms to let you engage with the results. If you know how to use SAS, great, you can engage with it that way, but the end users are often managers for these products, and we often require different ways to engage with the output in a more intuitive fashion to make decisions. So this latest iteration of our Sparrow is meant to improve on the decision support systems to better engage the end users. So as I just said, our Sparrow with this iteration of the project, we're adding new features to the existing model. We have the dynamic seasonal modeling components. We've included abilities to forecast into the future beyond the limited or the period of model calibration, both short and long-term forecasting. This is being done with satellite-based remote sensing data sets. So there are some new tools available to tap into those data sources to facilitate the forecasting capabilities of the model. We're also migrating to R, as I said, and there's been an update to the decision support systems that are provided for the modeling components. And these are actually developed in R Shiny, which is a platform that we use at the Estuary program for many of our tools, but now it's a pretty flexible platform for other applications, and this is being leveraged within the R Sparrow project. So I'll show you the web page where you can get to this content, but down here, if you go to this link, you can actually download the, I believe, version 1.1 at this point to start using it on your own. A big emphasis of this project, I showed you the project team earlier, a lot of people involved, but a big emphasis was just engaging end users throughout the full project life cycle. So As I said, Tampa Bay, Sarasota Estuary Program, we're one of the end users. The project team was actually calibrating the models to our watersheds, but the other groups being engaged were other NEPs and groups from the NERS program as well. So quite ambitious, engaging all these different user groups, but at the end of the day, we basically have a working version of the model that works out of the box for our watershed. All right, so basically, you know, if you wanted to use the model today, you can go online and download it and start playing around with it. And I'm going to show you a couple things first to sort of demonstrate how you might do that, but then kind of walk through the actual usage of the model in RStudio as well as the decision support tools. So I will get out of here and I'll show you first, if you wanted to just download the model, you can go to this webpage here, and this is actually on GitLab. This is a website that is, if you're familiar with our GitHub products that we have at the Estuary program, this is a different website for hosting essentially software packages under version control. So it's a way to kind of track the development history of the project, and it makes the code open and viewable and accessible. So this is actually a great added value of the latest iteration of Sparrow here, where now you can actually see the code. It's not, you know, tied up in SAS scripts. It's actually available online, and you can see how it evolves over time. So this is version, I believe, 1.1. We're actually up to version 2.0 now. It's getting very, very close to being released. There's some new features in 2.0 that add on to 1.1, but expect that to be available shortly. But if you wanted to get 1.1 now, you basically go to this website and download a zipped folder of this this entire bundle of software. And so I've already done this, of course, but if you were to download that, you essentially get a folder that looks something like this. So this is the entire directory that is in a totally standalone working version of the existing RSparrow 1.1 release. And so I'm just going to show you what the file structure looks like. This RSparrow master, if you're an R user, this is basically an R package that has all of the working code that implements all of the regression equations for applying the model to different watersheds. So when you download this, you get a version of the package, and you also get kind of a couple of folders and files that are for the users that include a lot of content for applying the model to your particular location. So being that we're from Tampa Bay Estuary Program and Sarasota Estuary Program, this version of it that you've downloaded is going to be the phosphorus model is applied to our watersheds. And so there's a couple contents in here that are worth noting. So there's input data. So this Tampa data file is basically all of the monitored sites that are used to calibrate the model in our watersheds. This is all stuff that's been prepared for us by the project team. There's GIS files that are used to actually reference the monitoring data to locations on the landscape and actually to create the results when the model is run. And then this is basically the results file after we've run the model locally on our machine. And so a lot of useful stuff in here that I will explain in a bit. But when you do download this file, and I'm just sort of running through this to show you how easy it is to run, you would run this model in RStudio basically. So I know not everybody in the call is an R user or an RStudio user. We have a lot of training resources to get people up to speed with using R, but I've been using R for a long time. I've been using Sparrow for about a month now, but it was very easy to just take this model and run it on my own computer, basically with limited understanding of how the model works, just knowing how to execute it. So it's very simple, but how this works is essentially you have a control file that have this loaded here on my screen. This control file just basically sets all of the options that you might want to change when you're running the model. But it's all fairly intuitive. The documentation is all very straightforward. But once you've got the parameters set up in the control file, you basically just execute the whole thing, run it in R, and it loads the RSparrow package. You get some results pre-populated in the results file, and you're good to go. And so I won't do that now because it does take a few minutes to run. But again, this is the phosphorus model for Sarasota and Tampa Bay. But when it's run, you get a lot of results that are very useful for, again, understanding nutrient loads into the system, where they're coming from, how the nutrient loads are partitioned into different sources, and understanding basically what the value the model can have for supporting management decisions. So I will just show you what some of those results are, just to, again, let you understand what value you get out of these models. And so this is the folder I get after running that control file. This is a run I've done for our watersheds. And then these are various folders that have awesome utilities that show you how good the model fit and what you get from the predictions. And so I've actually opened up some of them in my my browser here. What's super cool about these is these are actually HTML files that are pre-populated from R with text and summary documents. But just showing you a few of these right here, you know, these are all interactive graphics. You know, obviously, if you're looking at the model, you've got to understand, you know, how well the observations are to the predictions. So is the model actually giving you results that are true to what you see on the ground from the monitoring data? So you have these types of plots that can verify how good the fit is. You have various diagnostic plots. You know, essentially, one of the things we care about is, of all of the sources that are contributing to total phosphorus, which ones are contributing to various contributions of the load. And so you get sensitivity plots like this that can give you a sense of, you know, which factors are really driving the bus for contributing to the total phosphorus load. So you get plots like this. You get observed versus predicted plots that you can understand, you know, at different monitoring stations where we've calibrated the model, how well is the fit to the actual observed value. So you get summary plots like this. And then, of course, you get model predictions. And so this model has been calibrated to 2001 to 2014 for our watershed. But we've basically told it when we, in our control file, when we run the model, let's just look at 2001 to 2002 as just an example of what we get. And so we get these graphics here that are all interactive. It's a great tool, but you can look at individual reaches to look at the phosphorus load at any given location. And going back to this idea that this new model gives us a dynamic outlook on predictions. In other words, we get a seasonal prediction, which is something that the previous Sparrow models didn't provide. You can break it down by different season to understand how these loads might vary within a year as well as the year total. So these are again stream predictions. You can also aggregate the results by catchment to look at it that way as well. So this is, you know, if you're like an R power user, you want to run the model within RStudio, you get these pre-populated HTML files that give you a sense of how well the model's doing, where the predictions are in the watershed. An added benefit of this new RSparrow version is the decision support tool that I explained earlier is now implemented in RShiny. So when if you actually run this model by running all the code in the control file, you know, you get the results, you run the model, and it actually will open the decision support tool locally on your computer when the model's done running. And so I'll actually do that here by running this code. This is the way to open the decision support tool from an existing model run. But you run this, and what will happen is, give it a second, it opens up an executable, and it will open the decision support tool in my browser in a second. So I wanted to show you all of those results first that you get in the folder after running the model to show you that they're there, and that's one way to engage with them. But what's also cool is you can engage with the results using the decision support system. And so this is, again, just a graphical user interface built in our Shiny to look at the results in a way that is maybe a lot more accessible than, you know, digging into the file structure for the model, or, you know, running the model with different outcomes to get what you want. So this is, you know, very intuitive, point and click. There's a couple options here. We're actually going to run this interactive, meaning that we're going to get plots on the fly as opposed to just downloading a bunch all at once in batch. But we can select different options for the plotting format. So we have a static plot, which is basically just a JPEG or a PNG image of the results. Or we have options to look at the results with these interactive maps that I kind of showed you earlier. So there's different versions of the interaction maps that I'll show. We'll use Plotly at first. You can choose whether or not you show the results mapped to the streamlines or catchments, or the results by the site attributes that are used to calibrate the model. Or I'll explain in a minute, there's also scenarios you can run to sort of understand, you know, what happens to the model results with different decisions you might want to make for hypothetical management actions. So we'll just look at streams. We'll look at just all the average across all of the years for our model. Again, as I said, this was calibrated 2001 to 2014, but we'll average across all of those years. We'll do the load predictions, and this is looking at, we'll just do total phosphorus. These hover variables define what you see when you put your mouse over a part of the plot, but we'll just keep that to the default there, and then we'll just generate our map. So it takes us a few seconds, but still, you know, fairly quick in the realm of, you know, pulling up results for a pretty complex model. But this is the graphic that it's very similar to what I just showed you from the model output in the files you get with it, but now we can actually engage with it in the decision support system. So it's all interactive. You can mouse over a reach to see the load for a particular reach, what its COM ID is, and all that fun stuff. But this was an average for all of the years and all the seasons. Like, say, for example, we wanted to look at just 1 year. I'm going to do 2014 and the load estimates for those particular seasons. And now I'll look at fraction associated with wastewater. So this would be one component of the total load. I generate the map there. Wait a second, it'll upload. Okay, and now we have predicted total phosphorus load attributed to wastewater treatment plants in different seasons for 2014. So you can see, you know, the results look a little different, obviously, because, you know, wastewater treatment plants are discharging to different locations. But again, this gives you a sense of how you can use it to look at the results differently. I want to show you one last thing about the interactive graphics. So we do have a leaflet option, which is another way to present the results in an interactive format. We'll just do average again, and then we'll do total load. So Leaflet is another interactive library that works well with our Shiny. Plotly is an alternative to that, but Leaflet is cool because you can get these different base maps. So I use Leaflet a lot in a lot of the dashboards I create, but here it's cool because you can sort of see where the reach is in reference to the base map. And it's all, you get a changing scale and all that fun stuff. So that's just another option that you can use to view the results. The last thing I want to say is you can run these scenarios too. I actually don't want to go through that now, but basically the scenarios are good to sort of challenge the model to say, ask questions of, well, what happens if, land use changes, say, we have an increase in 10% ag land use. How would that change the load predictions for the streams? You can actually run that. Or you can run forecast scenarios by pulling in, some remote sensing satellite-based data to say, we have maybe climate predictions for how precipitation will change in the next, in the short term, say 6 months, or long term. What will that mean for the predictions of the load into these streams? And so with this decision support tool, you can actually run that to see how that changes, which is another cool feature that will be available to you if you want to use this. So I'm going to go back to my slides now. I just, again, wanted to run through the decision support tool. As I said, with the scenario processing for looking at sort of forecasting, these actually rely on satellite-based data. And so this is not a trivial thing to incorporate into the model. We actually use various satellite-based products to do this, from NMME, which is for like the short-term forecasting on the order of like 6 months or so, to the CMIP products for kind of like long-term climate change prediction scenarios. And it's kind of a task to actually pull those data sources in to actually incorporate into the results from a calibrated R-Sparrow model. And so we do have another tool that's been developed for us that actually takes in those different data sets to process them for upload into the decision support system. And so you have access to these slides, but if you want to download this tool, you can actually do this by clicking this link here. And it's actually just an executable that is very intuitive. It's all driven by, different options you can choose. It's sort of form-based. So once you download the data from these sources, you can use this tool to process it for upload to the DSS. And there is full documentation there associated with it. So it's fairly intuitive and simple to use. The last thing I wanted to mention is that, all of these tools are basically meant to run on your own computer. So you have access to the zip file for downloading it. You have the model, you run it on your computer, you get the results on your computer, and the Shiny application opens on your browser from a local instance of that application. Now, what we've done actually at the Estuary program is we've made this decision support tool available in the cloud. So we actually took all of the code for the decision support tool and we put it on our Shiny server that we use for a lot of our other applications. We put it on our server for you to actually use basically the model results from anywhere where there's access to the internet. And so this is great because essentially you don't have to download the model on your own. You could just basically pull up the browser and start playing around with the results. And so if you were to actually go to this URL, you could pull up the decision support tool and start playing around with it on your own. And again, this I think is a great way to increase the leverage of the tools by just lowering the barrier to entry of actually accessing the results. You just go to a URL and pull up the model results and start playing around with it that way. We are still actively developing this. Some of the functionality is not 100% there. So, if you do start playing around with it, you might see it crash occasionally, but that's sort of my issue, not the project team's issue. I've been the one that's been uploading this to our server, but look forward to that as a tool that hopefully will be kind of a a fully fledged application of this, where you can just basically pull up the web browser URL and start playing with the model results. So that's pretty much all I wanted to run through today. I kind of explained about the project, what we're doing with the Shiny server, what it provides. But now we're kind of at a stage where, again, this larger project has been going on for a couple of years. Now we're at the stage where we kind of want to hand it off to the end users. And that's why I'm giving this talk today. We are the end users. And so it's we are trying to emphasize to you all that now that this is available, we need to take ownership of it so we can actually start using this tool and make more informed management decisions. The project team has done a really good job of documenting all of the components of this model. I think taking a different perspective on how the previous documentation was made to how they can improve it now from the perspective of the end user, and sort of walking through, you know, in a very simple way how to use the model and how to use it for more informed decisions. So that's all available. It's great. You know, look forward to that as something to use moving forward. So yeah, that's all I wanted to talk about today. Again, you know, this is a great project. I've been very privileged to be a part of it in my own small way, and I'm definitely looking forward to seeing how we as a group can, you know, use this in our watershed. So I will definitely take any questions now if there are some for me.
Jay asked if there's any updates on the nitrogen modeling effort.
Yeah, so the model that I've showed so far is just the phosphorus model. I don't know where we're at on the nitrogen model. I'm hoping one of my colleagues that is on the line can speak to that.
Yeah, are you able to hear me?
Yes, Dick.
Yeah, this is Dick Smith. Well, I guess the short answer is we're working on it. One of the complexities here of nitrogen modeling, say in comparison to phosphorus, is the groundwater function of the system becomes very important, and so that's just added to the modeling complexity. If the question is how soon will total nitrogen be available on the system, I don't know. I think there are running versions of total nitrogen models now, and I think right now we're in the process of setting those up, but they would be kind of preliminary models, not the final form. I would think it would be a matter of a month or so to have the or less to have the existing total nitrogen model for Tampa Bay and Sarasota Bay running. Whether that, I don't know, it'll be a project decision as to whether that's how soon that's available kind of publicly versus a presumably better version of the model in the future. And that future would be several months off, I would say.
So yeah, it's on the way. Obviously, we care a lot about nitrogen here, and I knew someone was going to ask about that. But we're thinking about it, and it will be a product or a model run in the future.
Any other questions for Marcus? Oh, hang on, we got something popping up in the. So Marcus, Dave Tomasco had down in the chat, our biggest data gap is the amount of denitrification that occurs in groundwater transport and how that impacts assessments of nitrogen loads from septic tanks and fertilization with and without reclaimed water. How will that be addressed? Sticking with the nitrogen theme.
Yeah, I'm going to punt that one to the project team. I'm, my role is the end user of applying the model. I haven't been involved in the nitty gritty of actually calibrating these tools, so I don't know how a calibrated nitrogen load model would account for different sources of nitrogen, at least respect to that. But if someone else on the team can speak to that, I'd definitely love to hear it.
Well, I'll jump in again and say that, well, I guess there are kind of two answers to that. A standard, or the usual form of a sparrow total nitrogen model does account for groundwater sources, but it lumps everything together. So, for example, the agricultural fertilizer source term in the model would, the effects of that term would include nitrogen that moves through the system, both on the surface, through the soils and so forth, and deeper down through the groundwater source. And since those various pathways for nitrogen don't work the same, and they don't work at the same time scale, it's preferable to be able to separate those to some extent, because the lags in the system and so forth are very different, obviously, for the groundwater pathway than it would be for the soil and surface runoff pathway. And so that's really the distinction between what we're trying to do now, is move from an existing total nitrogen model, which would account for groundwater source in a lumped way and less satisfactorily, and that disadvantage is evident already in the predictive accuracy of the existing model. It's not as accurate as the total phosphorus model, put it that way. So the continuing work is to bring in separate terms for groundwater, and that's basically what we're attempting to do now, is to calibrate a separate groundwater source terms to separate the groundwater flow path from the surface flow path. Now, I've forgotten the wording of the original question, so I'm not sure I've really covered it. But so if you want to elaborate the question, I'll try to elaborate the answer.
This is Dave Tomasco. I'm not sure that this is an easy question to answer, and I don't expect anyone to be able to answer it really easily. But it is one of our big issues, which is we have loading models that have been developed for lots of water bodies, and we don't know exactly what rates of denitrification occur. So we don't know exactly the role of things like septic tanks, fertilizer, nutrient loads that come into our streams via groundwater seepage are really important part of what we need to manage. We just don't have really good data. So Sarasota County is collecting a lot of data that might be useful, but until that data are collected, we're using assumptions about how much denitrification occurs in groundwater, and we may be spot on or we may be off by a factor of 50%. We just don't know. So as we move forward, it's important to, I'm not disparaging the model, I'm simply saying it's an important data gap.
Yeah, we certainly recognize that. That's why we're going to the effort to add, to elaborate the model in order to account for that. It is important. It has a lot to say about the time scale of things. That, for example, the time scale of let's see here if I can cover myself. The time scale for seeing results of management actions, because as you point out, the nitrogen moves through the groundwater flow path is likely to end up in the stream somewhat later to much later in time than the nitrogen that flows on the surface. And so that's, yeah, can only agree. The only additional information I can give you about what we're trying to do, various ways we're trying to do this, to additional beyond what I've already said as far as the model structure goes, is to separate. One way to do that, this is the more difficult route really, is to build a separate model for the base flow load, which means we need to get observations of load or estimates of the transport rate or load rate of total nitrogen that occurs on the base flow in the stream rather than in all flow levels in the stream. And there are statistical ways to make an estimate of the base flow itself and of the amount of total nitrogen that's carried under base flow conditions. And we can assume fairly reliably that the nitrogen that's carried in the base flow is a groundwater pathway nitrogen. And so expanding the model to include really a separate model or at least separate terms for the base flow, the observed base flow loads is one way to do that. And we have examples of that in other systems, and we're now about ready to be able to do that for the Tampa system. Another thing to mention is that we do have groundwater information for the Tampa system as well as our other end user estuaries. So we have some estimates of the mean residence time of water in the groundwater system, and which will allow us to improve the model, because it allows us to say or to estimate when the nitrogen that appears in the stream at some point in time, when it entered the system, when it entered the groundwater. And so we do have information on this system. So it goes beyond just an empirical look at the what's in the stream. So I guess I could only say bear with us. You say it's a complicated thing, but it's important. So.
Thank you, Dick. Any other questions for Marcus specifically regarding the Sparrow model for Tampa Bay? All right, hearing none, thank you very much, Marcus.
Yep, thank you.
All right, our next presenters are Shane Painter and David Lloyd from Atkins. They will be informing us on the Courtney Campbell Causeway circulation monitoring results.
Yeah, if I could figure out how to get this window out of the way. Oh, can you guys see my screen?
We can.
Okay, and you see.
But we don't see the presentation version. We see like the PowerPoint working on it kind of version.
Okay, it's because it's not letting me. Okay. All right. How about now?
So we see the presenter view. Can you change which screen we're looking at?
I can try.
In the GoToMeeting tabs, you should have a screen selector.
Oh boy. Sorry, I don't know how to flip I have two monitors, so it's actually showing on my other monitor. I don't know how to flip these.
Right. Do you see the GoToMeeting app where you can select, like, you can unmute and mute yourself?
Yeah,
Do you have a screen tab?
I do. Start sharing my screen of main monitor 2. Okay. Why is it not letting me change anything? Okay. Now does it look different?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. Let me go back. Okay, I'm going to start here because you guys know a lot of the history of this. And I've presented at least 3 or 4 times. This has been kind of fun because we went all the way from the beginning. I think in 2011, Dave Tomasco and I formally presented this as a project to the DOT, and it was precedent setting, so it was difficult to permit. We had to do a lot of initial work and be careful to not set precedents. And so half of this presentation will be, okay, we're done. We're at the end. Our 2 years of monitoring for success criteria are done. What do they look like? And after that, David and I are going to talk a little bit about so the next iteration of this project, the way I think of it, is Cooper's Point. So, myself, David, and I think Sarah Kessler from the city of Clearwater's on. So that's a pretty exciting project that we think will help the Bay as well. All right, as everybody here knows, the Bay was really healthy a long time ago. Went through some bad periods. It's getting a lot better. The last couple of years, I know, have been a little rough, but north of the Bay was sort of on its own trajectory north of Courtney Tampa Causeway, and it's really because of the causeway built in the 30s. It really cut off circulation up and down the Bay. So we did a lot, as I mentioned. We did some initial work. Can the soils handle seagrass? Why is seagrass not growing in this area north of the causeway? Not only why is it not growing, but why are different types not growing? Why is it not as abundant? And so, we set up this criteria. Stratum D, very healthy, very desirable seagrasses. We use that as a control. To the north of the causeway, you see more rupia, other issues. And we kind of assumed that this was a nitrogen problem at the beginning, just like the rest of the Bay. Construction pictures are always fun. You can kind of see they started building on the north side first, flip to the south side. You can see the nice seagrass beds there on the south side. One thing to draw some attention here to is the nice seagrass beds necessitated us doing a lot of protection during construction. You can see the barrier there, the floating turbidity barrier. We used this at the time, a fairly new thing, rather than sheet pile wall, which has a lot of heavy equipment to come in and a lot of worry about impacting seagrass beds. We use these, I think they're water and sand filled just containers that you kind of set out there, and it's just a lot less impactful seagrass beds. Channel opened. There was heavy duty incentives to get that channel open, to get the flushing started, to get the success criteria, the monitoring going. But the construction didn't really finish for several months after that opening. So I think the idea was nice, but you can kind of see some of the results didn't quite normalize for a little bit after opening, and I think that's because construction was still going on. As I was kind of getting at earlier, we kind of thought that nitrogen was a problem initially, but the more we looked into it, I thought salinity might be more of a problem. The fact that a lot of fresh water builds up north of the bridge, it swings, it's very variable, goes from very low salinity to very high, whereas it's a bit more constant and a bit higher south of the bridge. And that's important because we'll kind of look at some of the, we'll call it nitrogen equivalencies that we worked on. The hydrodynamic model, as you all know on this call, many models have been done in this area. We built on those, got a lot more detailed information. We essentially use some of those as boundary conditions to nest a much more detailed model right at the bridge. I'm always very leery of model results. I always think if you're within 10, 20%, you're doing pretty good. And so we are predicting at least 50% residence time improvement. You kind of see that here. It was on the order of 7 days before. That model on the left gets a lot more blue on the right when it's opening. That basically means we reduce residency time. We use the same strata we've been using throughout that we set up right in the beginning with Dave help and Ed Cronin and David Loy and others. Stratum A is kind of close to the opening of the bridge. We'd expect that to be, not that much different than in the south side, but C, kind of where it's the worst, is where we really expected, to see some improvements. Always comparing it back to D, our control. A lot of lessons learned on monitoring Criterion. One of the big ones was we had 3 months of pre-opening data, and so we were monitoring north and south without the bridge. Opened it, and then we had 2 years post, and Swift, rightly so, and brought up that, hey, if we had rethought this, of course we were all sitting at the table and going around and around about how to do this, but they really wanted a lot more pre-data. Of course, you can't manufacture pre-data once the bridge is open, so that ship had sailed. But we were lucky and had EPC gauges 62 and 63. You see them there, right to the right. They're fairly close to the bridge opening, and they have many years of data. Of course, the residence time, and it drops the most right at the bridge opening and sort of damps out as you get further away. So we expect some dampening at 62 and 63. We actually changed the success criteria fairly recently to try to incorporate 10 years of data and also account for that fact that they're further away. So that's really what I'm going to spend a little more time on here. This is not off the bridge opening monitoring data, but off the EPC data. This particular graph for total nitrogen. We actually got 10 years of data on the left there. It doesn't look like it. We kind of normalized it and did some things to make it not have 10 years of pre-data and only 2 years of post-data to sort of have to eyeball. But a bunch of colors. The main thing is the orange is the actual data. We did a running average of the blue there. We have a baseline. It essentially is the average total nitrogen difference north to south. And then we had our 20% baseline, which our criteria for this one was 20% improvement. We had 50% higher closer to the bridge, but again, we're further away. We'd expect a little bit of dampening out. So for the most part, this is the running average well exceeds, you can see the green is the post running average, way below our 20% target. And we probably could have used 30 or 40% and still been okay. You can see this ends in 2020, this data. We actually have some more data. We just haven't, we've already gotten the success criteria approved by Swiftman. We haven't gone through the trouble to sort of update this graph as yet, but it's tending to trend better. For the differences. I know the overall bay water quality has some issues, but as far as this goes, making the north side look more like the south side is working better. I wanted to go back. I wanted to say that earlier, but we were setting up some of this criteria and looking at why is seagrass not growing here. We kind of based this on some of the work that Dave Tomasco had done in Puerto Rico and Lake Surprise, where we'd seen distance to open water is probably the biggest predictor of your water quality in these kind of areas. And we'll see the same sort of thing over on the Cooper's Point side of the ledger. That proved to be true here as well. Once we short circuited that and having to go over a mile and a half to more like a quarter mile, all these numbers improved greatly. We also wanted to look seasonally to say, hey, do we just pick good data points? Do we just pick perfect weather for some of these things? So we wanted to look at wet, dry season and then month to month. But I think you see here the story is that if these are positive, you're showing that the south side is less nitrogen than the north, which is what you'd expect. You would hope your blue, your post opening, would get smaller. In an absolutely perfect world, they would be 0 and it would, they'd be the same, but that's not going to happen because it's still got to get through a small bridge. Short of removing the whole causeway, you're just not going to get that. Despite the fact that we have that oddball July point where you did kind of get that. I don't know why that is. I don't know if we had tropical storm or something there. This is actually at the bridge opening. So you'll see we only have 3 months of data to the left of the gray line. That's the bridge opening. We only had really a couple data points there. They're both pretty high. You can kind of see that inflection in the orange line left of the bridge opening. And we had one all ball kind of reading later on, but again, the data that even post dates this is all showing well below the success criteria line. And that was a 50% improvement. So we felt that was pretty aggressive. That was what the model was showing. We've hit 80% on occasion. So again, I'm always pleasantly surprised when when real results match modeling results. Again, doing the same sort of thing. For chlorophyll, I didn't think I mentioned that. Which you would expect to somewhat parallel total nitrogen, but we do have some more where we kind of flip it there. And some of you may have some ideas on why that is. Some of those areas that we had certain events, but for the most part, we are concentrating. Are we hitting our success criteria here? Salinity. This is the big one. This is the one that really a lot of this is based on. This is kind of the opposite, where we wanted the north to be a little more saline and a little less variable. So rather than positive numbers, the scale flips. But again, the data we have even past this, I think, shows we're hitting maybe closer to 80% improvement in these two things. And this was the key. We kind of set up, I call it uplift equivalency. Really the fact that we're making the north more salty, more saline, means that the column holds less nitrogen, which means the bay is impaired for nitrogen. All the permitting and targets are set up for nitrogen. They're not really set up for salinity. So we kind of had to come up with, okay, how do I make that work? We're not exactly reducing a bunch of nitrogen per se. We're increasing the salinity so that there's less nitrogen in the column, and we are flushing. So the long and short is we're pretty thrilled with these results. The idea was, let's focus on water quality, let's focus on light penetration, let's focus on making the conditions for seagrass grow, and hopefully they will. Again, this one almost couldn't be drawn more perfectly. You're seeing less difference between the north and south in terms of salinity every single month, every single wet season. I mean, with almost one exception in December, but other than that, we couldn't have fabricated these and had it come out much better. So our success criteria that we set up mostly have met requirements. We've actually met even the last one. We just haven't gone through the permit modification as yet. So, with that, I don't know if it's better to take questions on that and then hit Cooper's point, or hit Cooper's now and then take questions overall. I guess I'll just roll right into Cooper's unless.
Yeah, I don't see any questions in the chat, so I think we can keep going.
Okay. So really, because of the success of Old Tampa Bay, a number of things have happened. The DOT was so thrilled with it that we actually wrote a statewide manual on innovative regional projects. I mean, they're all in, at least at a top level. I mean, some of the bureaucracy and district to district, is sort of mixed depending on who you talk to, but they really want to do more projects like this. The city of Clearwater, as part of that, wanted to really look at Cooper's Bayou. Very, very interesting project. Even though it's on the same part of the Old Tampa Bay, it's a whole different set of problems and challenges. And so when I saw Sarah Kessler, I think, is on. So Sarah, if you have anything to add at any point, jump in. I don't want to misspeak on some of these things. You guys know the water quality problems far better than I do, so we don't need to run through that. Kind of similar to the Old Tampa Bay cut on the east. Historically, this area is just kind of isolated, and the causeway coming in, certainly didn't help. We kind of found that when the pyridinium cysts are there, and so in a way, this is probably not a salinity problem. On the other side, I think it's more of a residence time problem. These cysts have a long time to sit, to manifest. How do we deal with that? And so this is basically the project. It's been through a lot of iterations, a lot of thought on, can we split this up? Can we do different things? And so there's a component on a DOT road. I mean, this is a city Clearwater project, but they are working with the DOT on, the DOT part and the overall water quality part. Somewhat different from that job. I mean, this job in most ways is a let's just make it better kind of a project. We're not necessarily getting into setting up credit banks and the seagrass credits and the water quality credits that we did in Old Tampa Bay, in part because those are pretty good. This is really, how do we make this not have fish kills, not have so many pyrethanium blooms, improve our water quality targets, and make this a very useful place for the public who wants to kayak. I mean, we've talked about there's some old mosquito ditches in here. Some of those would help to drive some water. You see that line kind of on the bottom left of the graphic. Can a kayaker go through there? Not only a kayaker, but water exchange, tidal water exchange. Once it gets through there, as well as through the yellow bridge opening there right on Cooper's Point, it needs to short circuit the path to the open bay, almost exactly like on the east side. So we looked at a 350-foot cut opening through Cooper's Point. We looked at longer pieces. We looked at shorter pieces. We looked at pieces, extending that bridge that's already out there, and found we had to push it back. This is as far east as we could push it and still really get the residence time reduction that we think is going to help here. There's also a little bit of dredging component of this because there's a lot of muck built up in there. We're also looking at doing kind of a multi-habitat thing, which I'll let David get into more. Salt marsh, mangroves, again, improving water quality to hope you can get more persistent seagrass. I'll let Dave talk more about that. Here's where we are. We've done a study. We've done the same model that we already used for Old Tampa Bay, that's calibrated, accepted. We've added a little more detail on this side, expanded it out, but that's the base of this. We've done some baseline environmental surveys. And we're in the middle of permitting. I mean, we're in the middle of requests for different information and going back and forth. And again, this is a difficult project. Worry about precedence and success. I don't think we'll have the same extent of success criteria because we're not trying to set up necessarily the credits that we were on the east side. I won't go through the model stuff that much. I mean, it's kind of the same, but this is kind of where we are. You can see right around the bridge opening, kind of similar to Old Tampa Bay, we're pushing 80% in a modeling world, which we actually exceeded those targets for the most part in reality. So, hopefully that'll happen here as well. But even if we just hit these, I think it's pretty substantial. 37% back up in the bayou, and hitting around 25 to 27 a little further down the bottom. And again, it's difficult for a model to really get into, okay, if you improve a mosquito ditch and you exchange flows, that part of it is probably not as reflected in this model as it could be. And I think that's just going to help the numbers, in the end. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Dave. I'll still run the slideshow and let him talk about some of the field work we've done and where we are.
Thanks, Shane. Just kind of moving into the actual data collection portion of this now. Shane set it up pretty well there. Big thing was, getting out there and on site and trying to get a feel for what the baseline conditions are for the site. What's there currently, and where's the room for the improvement, and then try to be able to characterize and quantify those improvements. So we went through and really spent a decent amount of time traipsing through the site with myself and Renee Price and others at Atkins. Looking through, kind of doing a characterization of the mangroves, getting a feel for what their current condition is. Are there areas where there are having issues? Is there areas where we need to kind of focus? We knew obviously from this area being historically ditched that there was going to be both mosquito ditches as well as the associated spoil piles throughout the site. So we wanted to be able to quantify and kind of characterize those as well. And we also looked at seagrass within the bayou itself. We knew historically and currently there are seagrasses within the northern extent of the Cooper's Bayou. We've seen the existing data and felt pretty confident on that. We were kind of more curious about what is really south of Cooper's Point Park, which are signified by those blue triangles in the middle and lower portions of Cooper's Bayou. I guess next slide. Let me go ahead and do the next slide there, Shane.
Sorry.
There we go. So on the site, we went through and really quantified. We were curious how much we are actually seeing out there as far as spoil piles go. We did identify 38 different spoil piles during the survey. They range from fairly small, as you would expect for some. This one, 0.003, I guess, was the smallest one we had, acres, and then some larger ones, just over an acre. 60% of those piles contained primarily Brazilian pepper, as you would expect. Some of the nuisance exotic and inappropriate species kind of moving in due to the elevation changes. We had some other areas too, some ditches that even had, cactus species as well. They ranged anywhere from an elevation standpoint from 10 inches as high as 4 feet in elevation. We identified 38 spoil piles, as I mentioned before, in situ. During the actual field effort. We sort of added to that through aerial interpretation of aerial imagery, and actually mapped about 214 piles throughout the site, through photo interp. And we came up with about a little over 4 acres worth of just spoil piles throughout the entire site. That picture is kind of a representative photo of what we were seeing on site. One of the other elements we looked at, as I mentioned before, was really looking at the mosquito ditches. We again kind of did a pretty extensive field effort. We mapped about 11 mosquito ditches that were field verified. Various configurations, and sizes, dimensions ranged from 14 inches to 80 feet in width. So some are pretty substantial. And as far as depth goes, there were some that were fairly shallow. You're seeing about 10 inches there, and other ones that ranged up to about 5 feet in depth. And certain areas had many obstructions to flow to some degree, and some limited flushing due to those obstructions. And I guess the next slide, Shane.
What? Not changing. Hang on. There it goes.
And as part of that effort, as I mentioned, we also went through. We had existing data from the estuary program that we looked at, as well as obviously seagrasses that have been mapped in the area since 1988 by the district. Aerially, and we went through and actually set up a number of randomized sample plots to kind of look at what we saw within that that middle and lower portion of Cooper's Bayou, as I mentioned before, and really came across really was fairly debaucherate of seagrass. We didn't come across, I believe, really much of anything within the 16 plots that we did, which was what we anticipated, but we wanted to be able to check that for sure. We also, as part of that effort, went through, if you can dip back one more slide real quick, Shane, or actually that's fine too. I was just going to say that we also, as part of the effort too, just from a quantification of potential impacts and trying to avoid impacts where possible, we did an edge of bed survey, adjacent to the proposed cut that's going through Cooper's Point, as well as the edge of bed adjacent to the cut proposed through the Courtney Campbell. And next slide. So this really was looking at kind of the seagrass historic trends in the area adjacent and kind of north, adjacent to the project site and north of the proposed cuts, and really kind of surrounding those cuts. And as mentioned before, everybody's familiar. SwiftMud obviously has done this aerial imagery. They've had imagery flown and aerial mapping of seagrass since 1988, every 2 years. At the time, we didn't have the 2020 data yet, so this only shows through 2018. But we were trying to figure out what those trends were. Were we seeing seagrass there consistently all the time? Were you having this consistent coverage, or were we seeing kind of ephemeral coverage? And where we're having, times of the year or even years where we did not have grass where we previously did. And this kind of shows each of those years, the mapping effort, between what is kind of seen as being continuous grass versus patchy seagrass. And on this next one, what we did, and it's a similar approach to what we actually did for Old Tampa Bay on the other side of the causeway, where we looked at seagrass really persistence based on the coverage, whether that grass was there today and tomorrow and in the future, and if it was there historically. And as I mentioned before, we went and we used all the data that we had from SwiftMud from 1988 to 2019, so 9 different events. The map that's on the left shows the values essentially through 1 through 9. So essentially the 1 being the grass in that particular area was mapped 1 time in that 9 period record or 9 event record. It was mapped as grass once, and then the highest would be it was mapped as seagrass every single time that mapping was conducted. The map on the right actually was where we binned the data and looked at and broke it into low, moderate, and high, trying to get a feel for where our low persistence was versus something that was actually very persistent. And you can see in that graphic that and basically also the way we bend it was low was pretty much 0 was never called seagrass, 2, 3. Moderate or medium persistence was between 4 and 7, I think, or 6, and then high was 7 through 9. So 9 out of the events it was actually mapped as grass. And so you do see the green is actually indicating where we really had some persistent seagrass coverage and have had it since 1988 when the mapping was started. But conversely, we also have areas where there was only kind of flashy persistence. There was grass there at times and other times not, and a decent amount of acreage that was associated with that low or medium persistence. And so the thought is that in these areas where you've got say for instance rupia, which we do have in this area, other areas obviously here adjacent to north of the causeway as well as south of the causeway, there's a significant amount of chlorpha as well. We wanted to see where are there areas where there's potential to improve. Excuse me, similar to what we had on the east side, where we actually get more variability in the species, as well as just more consistent coverage. And the areas that we, just obviously the south side of this shape being shown, there was about a 77, I think, % reduction in the residence time immediately adjacent to the cut. And then I think, and Shane can correct me if I'm incorrect, but then a larger shape extending north from where the proposed cut's going to go, which pretty much extends all the way out to the point. I think we were seeing about an average of 50% reduction in residence time. So in those areas, we're going to improve the water quality, and in so doing, hopefully, provide the ability for some of the appropriate species and species, I guess, with more persistent coverage, give them the opportunity to actually recruit in further and have a more consistent, fish habitat instead of having it be more ephemeral. And I think that pretty much covers what I was wanting to cover. Getting back to the mangrove side of things, the thought is to do selective restoration of some of the mosquito ditches due to, and that's something we were talking about the other day, due to the fact that some of these mosquito ditches, have been known to and do provide, fish habitat for species. It would not be a carte blanche type approach. We would, retain some of the larger ditches, some of the ones that already are maybe a little bit deeper, and some of the ones that have more pronounced coverage to Cooper's Bayou, as well as the Old Tampa Bay on the other side, to allow one for the, potentially the movement of these fish species through them, as well as passive recreation and active recreation opportunities as well. As Shane mentioned, focus on the ability of kayakers to be able to kayak these areas, as well as provide some of the additional flushing as well. And then some of the other mosquito ditches, kind of do a matrix management type approach, case by case, where we're some of the more shallow ones that are kind of impeded, potentially backfill those to provide kind of a more consistent topography. Also looking at hydroblasting or physical removal of the spoil piles to kind of provide that back to, or restore that back to a natural grade so that we're not affecting the sheet flow and natural hydrology of the site. And I think that pretty much says it. And also, Shane did touch on this before, but certainly there's a focus on the pyridinium blooms. Obviously, Tampa Bay has seen issues with pyridinium blooms in the past, certainly Old Tampa Bay specifically. And the thought is if we can get moving water through there, water moving better through the system and flushing out, not having such a high residence time, that we can help kind of combat the conditions, the water quality conditions that can be conducive to these bloom developments. And with that, I think we will go ahead and turn it over to questions, and or if Sarah would like to make any additional comments.
I'm sorry, I had to step away for just a minute, so you may have covered this, but with the dredging of Cooper's Bayou, then we're also going to put a few sediment boxes in along Bayshore to collect some of that sediment so it doesn't drain directly into Cooper's Bayou as well. So that's another part of the project, if it wasn't covered.
Yeah, we actually didn't cover that. That's a good point. I mean, it kind of gets into, we had a meeting with Maya and Edition and talked about some of the, multifaceted habitat of this, the salt marsh, the seagrass improvement, the mangroves, and how it could be viewed as restoration, especially when you go back and like a lot of those stormwater inputs and sediment was not there a long time ago. Certainly that's a bit of a different condition, and we're looking at that side of things too. Just kind of to a couple of the chat questions. So the models do take into account the replacement culvert at the Patel College. It's the culverts in there kind of assumes it's open flow, but then it uses some of the topography through the mosquito ditches, and that's all. Not much water really moves through there that well, unless you actually make it so that essentially that a kayaker can get through there. But as I mentioned, it's really more the exchange of water to get to that culvert under the college. So yes, it has, but I think we could do a little better job once we refine the mosquito ditch restoration a little bit. Someone asked about the structural limitations. So I guess it depends on exactly how the question is asked. I mean, there certainly is a cost to the lengthening of the bridge, quite a lot of cost. It goes up so rapidly. So we were trying to get the most bang for our buck. We looked at 200, 300, 1,000, pushing it over. So I don't think there's real structural limitations. I mean, the other thing we went through in Old Tampa Bay that may not be apparent is like at some point this whole thing should probably be raised, right? I mean, not just because of the causeway, but because it floods fairly easy. It's an evacuation route, and if you build just a small bridge and you raise it up, you're having to do a lot of road work because we got to maintain your certain 3% grade to get up there, and either go wall or if you have slopes, you go way out and you hit seagrass, which we don't want to have anything go out above the footprint of the road, so they're already. So those are kind of the structural footprints that we balanced in that length, and also that location. I'm not sure if that actually answered the question or not. There's a question here about Dave's kind of have a comment. Yeah, it was as I kind of mentioned, I think the more we communicate early, we had this conversation yesterday, the more we kind of have other projects in the Bay that have mutual benefit. I mean, sometimes we don't think of that benefit as just to the Bay, but it also could be to the Hillsborough County or City of Clearwater for various reasons, whether it's credits or this or that, and getting early on. I mean, that was part of the statewide manual we wrote for doing these kind of projects. Communicate early and figure out the mutual benefits, because they're almost always there. And sometimes we just get in our own silos and it's easier to go down this path. But this was pretty exciting because I feel like it opened many, many doors. Besides the project itself, I think it led directly to the city, the Cooper's Point being more of a collaborative project than it probably would have been before Old Tampa Bay. And I hope for many more of these because they're fun to work on.
Absolutely.
Shane, is
So-
the intent to open this area back up to public access?
I would
that
defer
is
that to
the
Sarah.
yeah, that is the plan, is to open it up. Like currently, the public can go out there with approval. Like I have to go out there and unlock the gate for you. But we're hoping to be able to have trails, and we'll use the DOT building, DEP. That's a complicated building, but have that as a trailhead there on the corner of Bayshore and Gulf to Bay, and from there be able to walk the trails back from that location.
So with the widening of that one connection, is the plan then to, I think there's an existing bridge there, correct? Would the idea be to replace that bridge?
So there are several bridges out on Cooper's Point, and so in that particular location, it would be building a new bridge over that cut, and so that would be a new additional opening, and it would there would be a bridge there to be able to cross that.
Yeah, there's a question from Trevor on improved residence time being somewhat localized. I mean, that is true. And I guess the answer to me is, we got to do a lot of good projects and have them kind of be additive. I think we looked at it where you get at least a 10% improvement in residence time is around 200 some odd acres. It was more like 300 for Old Tampa Bay. But the focus here really is the bayou, and really trying to do anything we can to minimize pyridinium. I know we're not going to eliminate it. And I think we're just going to have to work together on many projects along these lines to have it more widespread across Old Tampa Bay.
Yeah, if there's a phone caller who's creating feedback, if you're calling in on the phone, can you make sure you're muted? I can't seem to figure out who it is in the controls.
Yeah, and there's another question, Gary, from the pond. We did talk about that. I'd actually have to get with the team, Mandy, Sarah, and others. That has come up as a discussion and a bit of a problem. I don't know that we're inherently going to address it as part of this project, but I think the thought was that pond kind of actually discharges fairly close to where we would be doing some improvement through the bridge, or it's not really a bridge, it's like a con span or a box culvert. I'll just was I muted that whole time?
Not the whole time, just for a second, because I was just trying to get rid of that feedback.
Oh, okay. So anyway, noted. We'll look at that a little more. I got to remind myself what we're doing.
So we're also working on the Actionable Science Grant for Old Tampa Bay because, as Shane noted, we've been struggling to meet water quality criteria in this Bay segment for a number of years now. And so, stringing together these kinds of projects is something that we're very interested in doing. And so any kinds of insights that folks have about how to make the permitting process, more supportive of these kinds of efforts, I'm sure we'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on those sorts of things. And understand that we're looking at modeling, stringing together multiple projects that look like the one on the Courtney Campbell, what is being proposed at Cooper's Point, and then potentially even on the other bridges like the Howard Franklin and the Gandy.
I think going to add to what Maya just said. You know, you have to start from the premise of what Shane originally showed, was the causeway was constructed in the 20s. You know, it wasn't there. The bay was operationally, the circulation in the bay was operationally different back then. We have a new sort of baseline with the causeway in place. And I know there's been active restoration in and around a lot of these areas, but the ultimate goal is to get Old Tampa Bay back on track. And it's going to take a variety of different projects to achieve that end. And to Trevor's point, in terms of, you know, modeling the broader, more comprehensive benefits to Old Tampa Bay, it's hard to do that within the frameworks, I think, that are set up for these individual projects. So flexibility of the permitting agencies is important in that respect, in terms of seeing the bigger picture and piecing these smaller projects together to achieve that greater benefit for the entirety of the Old Tampa Bay segment. And that's, I think, much of the difficulty in the permitting process through some of these projects. Of course, we don't want to see harm done to areas in the bay, but if it has broader, longer lasting benefits to the entirety of the segment, then you kind of have to wade through that and look for the greatest bang for the buck that can be achieved in stringing these projects together. And that's the point of view of the estuary program, and what we're hoping to you know, further refine research agendas around in terms of the No Actionable Science Grant that Maya just mentioned. I just want to throw that perspective out there as well to the group in these discussions.
Yeah, Jamie, I don't think I responded to your chat question, but we are trying to be as careful as we can with some of the existing restoration. I think we actually talked about getting some details on that particular project, if I'm thinking of the right one. But noted. The last one is permitting status. We're in the middle of permitting. There's a lot of RI questions going back and forth, just because it's a fairly multifaceted project, and so I'm hoping we'll get through that relatively quickly.
Mark Schrammick is also in the chat, and he always recommends a pre-application meeting with the natural resource agencies through the Army Corps of Engineers. So,
Shane and Maya.
Yeah.
Hi. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yep.
Good deal. So Shane, I appreciate your and Dave's effort on this presentation here. And as Maya had just suggested, our agency is an advisory agency to the Army Corps of Engineers for any Clean Water Act or Rivers and Harbors Act permits that might be required. And I've personally worked closely with the city of Clearwater on an earlier iteration of the Cooper Bayou project. And my comment you probably saw in the chat was related to that recent replacement of the culvert by the Patel Nova Medical Facility. And I think that might actually lend itself well to improving hydrology throughout Cooper's Bayou, because a challenge we had previously, the culvert that was in place, was choked quite a bit with mangrove propagules and debris over probably decades and decades, you know, of tidal flushing. But now that culvert's been replaced, and it seems to have certainly opened up the connectivity at the southern end of Cooper Bayou with Tampa Bay, I think that might be a viable alternative that you might want to consider. I mean, hydrologically speaking, if you get strong flushing up in the north end of the bayou and it comes down and you have the velocities, you know, the tidal prism to push through there, I think that might actually improve water quality in Cooper's Bayou. So my point is, I encourage early and active collaboration and early engagement with our agency as well. But thank you.
Thank you. And I guess along those lines, these kind of projects, I think collaboration is always best. coordination with all the, like this. I mean, I think it's just helpful. You all know so much about the bay and anything. It's just helpful to get all our ducks in a row as we get to the permitting process and the history and support. All right.
Well, thank you both. Aaron had to step out to teach a class, so I'll take the reins from here. The next items that we have on the agenda are open discussion items. One of the things that we wanted to talk about a little bit was some of the ulva blooms that we've been observing throughout Tampa Bay in the late fall and early winter months. So I'm going to show you a couple of pictures first. This first picture was taken, I think, in October, or no, yeah, in October, off of Emerson Point in Manatee County. Very extensive ulva blooms that Ed observed covering the seagrass beds over there. And then later on in December, I started getting some notice from some of the captains that fish in Hillsborough Bay near the kitchen. And this video was provided of an ulva bloom. Let's see if it'll load. There we go. It's just kind of giving you an idea of how thick things really were in the December timeframe. And so we had a lot of questions about what was causing that and what we've been observing. And so, for really the idea is to just make sure that the TAC is aware that these significant ulva blooms have been observed in a couple of different parts of the bay in the winter months. To share just sort of some thoughts about what might be the causes or what we might do about it, talk a little bit about understanding the baseline information about macroalgae blooms. I'm also going to turn over the controls to Megan Schrant with FWC, because they also observed the bloom in Hillsborough Bay and were able to take some measurements there. And so just wanted to kind of tee this up for open discussion. So Megan, I'm going to toss the controls over to you.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to see if I can share the correct screen. Maya, can you help me out with what you guys see, if you see anything?
Yeah, we see your regular PowerPoint like you're working in there, not your presentation. Now we see your presenter view. Perfect.
All right, cool. Figured it out. All right, so as Maya said, I'm with the Fisheries Independent Monitoring Group at FWC, and we also are on the water usually, well, every month. So we had started noticing the ulva blooms as well. So we had reached out to the estuary program to let them know and share some pictures with what we were seeing on the water. Oh, apparently my controls are not working. Okay, so just to kind of give you a picture of where we are in the water every month. We're sampling every month in Tampa Bay. The map on the left shows you all of our sampling sites for 2021, and they are random sampling sites. So we're not going back to the same exact site every month. And we're usually using 3 different gear types, which are color coded in the map there for you. And the first noticeable ulva bloom that we had seen was noted on November 10th. And it was just north of Archie Creek on the flat that's like on the east wall of Hillsborough Bay. They were sampling a 21.3 meter seine here, which is one of our smaller seines. So it collects some of our smaller juveniles and smaller fish and invertebrates. So the pinpoint on the map here shows you exactly where this site was. And these are photos from the actual sampling event. So you'll notice that we've got significant algal blooms, just like the previous pictures that Maya had shown. And in the photo on the right here, you can note even the algal blooms, the alga kind of reaching to the surface up here in these different patches. So it's pretty widespread there. And since we were doing our sampling here, we had some water quality measurements as well. And you'll notice that dissolved oxygen is actually quite high, which isn't unexpected. Obviously, there's a lot of photosynthesis going on during the day, so we would expect that dissolved oxygen to be relatively higher at the area. And we also noted higher pHs, which is also likely a byproduct of that photosynthetic activity. And we've got some preliminary catch data here from this net. So we had actually what's not atypical in our nets for these small seines in the area. So we had a couple of blue crabs, some rainwater killifish, shrimp, and gobies. Since November 21, we've been out for both December trips and January trips. And we had 2 trips in each of those months that were in Hillsborough Bay area. So in December, the first trip that went out there sampled in extremely dense fog, so they didn't really note the bloom like we would have on like a clear day. They had about 30 gallons of mixed algae in one of our large seine nets. And the second trip that went out had about 265 gallons of alva species as bycatch, but they did note normal water quality and only 2 biology records in that 183 meter seine. And they did note that the bloom was still present in the area in December at that time. We also have been back out in January. So the first trip was on January 7th. They sampled 2 different trawls near where the November site was, where we had first noted the bloom, not in the exact same spot, obviously. They noted that the bloom was still present. They had about 5 gallons of alva species bycatch and about 9 different biology records. They also had to abort one of their trawls due to excessive alva bycatch. And the second attempt at the trawl in a slightly different area had about 40 gallons of bycatch for that alva species. And then another trip was made in Hillsborough Bay and McKay Bay, which is just north and west of the November sites. And they did not note any signs of the alva species bloom, but they did say that there were remnants of it pushed up into the mangroves and kind of stuck on the rocks in the area. And they did not have any significant alva bycatch or signs of it while driving in between those, between all their sites. And the last thing I wanted to note was that after talking to some of our staff and everything, the last time they're really kind of noted alva blooms was after Piney Point discharges in 2003, which those discharges were in a very different area into Bishop Harbor starting in January 2003. And the FIM group did do a 1-year Nectin survey during that discharge period and had compared fish catches to historical data during non-discharge periods. They didn't see an overall community composition difference, but they did note that in spring of 2004, there was a very large alva species and Gracilaria species macroalgal bloom. And it was so significant that they actually did mechanical harvesting of the bloom in the area, which worked there because it's a very small and enclosed system. So that's really all we have in terms of observations for the alva blooms. We don't have a cause for it, and we can't say what's causing it and sort of what the effects are at this point in time. But being out on the water, we are noticing that it is around, but it seems to be that we're getting less reports of the bloom still being really proliferate.
Yeah, so we have 2 comments in the chat. One is that Ed noticed a buildup of alva along Bayshore Boulevard in Hillsborough Bay this past weekend. And then Chris Anastasio also noted that the alva blooms were picked up in the aerial photography for the seagrass maps. So one of the things that I think we all points that got hammered home over the past year or so is the importance of having eyes on the bay regularly and kind of knowing the ups and downs of things that are going on. And so that's sort of what this item is about. But also in all of the field work that the estuary program with the help of our partners conducted, is that we don't necessarily have a good baseline data set to document sort of seasonal trends and macroalgae composition. And so that's something that we've identified as a potential gap or a need that we might need to consider in ways that we can look at maybe using some of the existing data sets that are out there, or designing studies and monitoring protocols going forward to get a better handle on some of those trends. It's kind of interesting that the places that we're seeing these really notable blooms are sort of at the reaches of where the plume touched. And so in terms of causality, it's hard to say if it's associated with that significant nutrient load that came from the Piney Point discharge or from other things. And talking to like Roger Johansson, who is very familiar with these and with documenting these kinds of blooms, he was looking to see if there were maybe some potential other sources of dissolved inorganic nitrogen that are maybe driving the proliferation of algal blooms. So I just wanted to kick it out for open discussion. I see Dave Tomasco in the chat too. Dave, if you want to unmute and let people know.
Yeah, we've been working with St. John's River Water Management District. They have a couple of manuscripts that are in review for Frontiers of Marine Science, and we've seen advanced copies of them. And what they fear is happening in the River Lagoon to a certain degree in certain areas is basically a phase shift, from a macrophyte dominated system to a phytoplankton dominated system. And they believe one of the things that's happened is the mass of nutrients that was associated with seagrasses has become available through die-off to other sources. It's in lake work, it's common, paradigm that you go in and the war on hydrilla, chemically treating hydrilla, flips a lake to be phytoplankton dominated. And so we've worked with them to come up with estimates, and it ranges, depends upon the biomass, but roughly our numbers are about 4 to 25 pounds of nitrogen per acre of seagrass above biomass alone would become available for something else. So once you lose that seagrass, the pool of nutrients that was kept in place with that biomass becomes available for something. So that's problematic. But in Sarasota Bay, we believe that some of our macroalgae blooms are happening because of a seagrass die-off. And so I don't know if that's happening in your system, but it may be an internal pool of nutrients to look at as well. And another reason why you don't want to lose any more seagrass is because it's a positive feedback loop in a negative direction.
So Natasha's asking if we're looking for monitoring staff to report blooms, and I think that's one way that folks can help. Also, when you're going out and doing your annual seagrass transect monitoring, that's something that better characterizing the macroalgae that you see at those sites, I think, would be useful. But generally, we're kind of looking for potential data sources that we might be able to mine for. Something that gives us a glimpse at those seasonal historic baseline trends of macroalgae throughout the bay segments in Tampa Bay. So if Pinellas County has some of that information, I think we'd be interested in checking it out. And I know that it's part of the FIM bycatch data. And so we've talked a little bit with Megan about ways we might be able to analyze that data set as well. Marcus, do you want to chat about the tool that you put together, that analysis of trends in the Alafaya?
Yeah, this is, I guess, kind of building off of Dave's comments somewhat. When we first heard about the blooms in Hillsborough Bay from the FIM crew, one of the thoughts we had was maybe it was something coming down the Alafaya, because I believe the stations that Megan was talking about were just north and south of the outfall of the Alafaya. And so we thought we could just look at some of the EPC monitoring data for the last couple of months, or the prior couple of months preceding the sample event from FEM, to see if maybe there was some signal of something coming down that river, whether it be a nutrient pulse or some sort of fecal indicator bacteria or something like that. And so the link I dropped into the chat was just a quick and dirty evaluation of the 2021 results compared to basically the last 10 years of data that we have for Alafaya for 4 stations that are in the marine portion of the Alafaya. And long story short, we didn't really see anything that suggested there was something coming down the Alafaya that could trigger that bloom. So to Dave's point, not to definitively say it's a seagrass die-off causing this, but at least from the quick and dirty analysis that we did, it didn't look like it was a source coming from the Alafaya that was driving it. So I just wanted to drop that into the chat to show that as a potentially alternative line of evidence of what could be causing these blooms, at least in this part of the bay.
Marcus, if I could build on that just a second. One of the things as well that's really helpful is, it's a quick and dirty rule of thumb, but if you assume a 3% nitrogen content dry weight for macroalgae and a 90% of that wet weight being water, then it means a pound of nitrogen can get you 300 pounds of algae. And that might vary, but let's say it's only 100 or something like that. But that's the number that we come up with our numbers around here in Sarasota. So, if you're releasing, 4 pounds of nitrogen with an acre of seagrass, which is on the low end, that 4 pounds of seagrass has the ability to give you, 300 times as much in terms of macroalgae. So it doesn't take a lot of nitrogen to get you a hell of a lot of macroalgae. And that's just something to keep in mind. You don't have to have a massive load to get you a massive amount of macroalgae if the nutrients that were in seagrass are no longer held in seagrass. You can get an algal bloom that becomes much more visible than what that meadow originally was.
So none of this is to say that the sky is falling or to anything like that, but it's just to make sure that all of our TAC members are aware, and that if you had any ideas or things that you'd want us to analyze or think about, this would be the time to talk about them. I'm not really seeing anything else in the chat right now though, so I'm going to move on because we have a couple of other items for discussion. The next thing is, I just wanted to put a reminder out there that this year we will be doing an interim update of the CCMP, which was originally updated in 2017. So we currently have a request for proposals on the street to update the actions to reflect progress that we've made between 2022 and 2017. Also to look at things about how to engage stakeholders and how to incorporate adaptation actions into the plan overall. So if you're interested in reading that RFP and perhaps responding, the link is in the agenda. I'm also looking for RFP reviewers. I have one person secured, and I'd be looking for 1 or 2 others. So if you were interested in volunteering to review the proposals that we get in, please send me an email at mburke@tbep.org. A couple of things that we'll also be dealing with in that process, and we'll be relying on the TAC for, specifically one of the questions that our policy board and our management board have brought up throughout the strategic planning process was asking us to consider expanding the study area for the Tampa Bay Estuary Program. This could mean including things like Clearwater Harbor, St. Joseph Sound, the Anclote River portion of Pinellas County and Pasco County, perhaps portions of the Gulf of Mexico up in Pasco County. And so we'll be looking for feedback on that potential expansion. And we did review the research and monitoring priorities, but keep an eye out for a directed ask for your feedback on the research and monitoring priorities that are included in the CCMP that helps drive things like the Tampa Bay Environmental Restoration Fund proposals and the work that we fund through our annual work plans. So all of that research that, you know, we rely on partners to conduct or that we conduct ourselves. We'll be looking for your feedback and updating those priorities to make sure that they're reflecting the current research questions and challenges that the Bay is facing. Are there any initial thoughts or comments on the CCMP update, the boundary expansion, or research and monitoring priorities?
I unmuted all in case people were trying to speak up.
This is the portion of the meeting where I threaten to go back to in-person meetings if I don't hear feedback.
Maya, I stepped out for a sec. What are you threatening us over?
I'm just wanting some initial thoughts on conceptually the idea of changing the study area boundaries for the Tampa Bay estuary program to include potentially things like the Clearwater Harbor, St. Joseph Sound, the Anclote River watershed, those portions in Pinellas County and Pasco County, and maybe portions of the Gulf of Mexico along the Pasco County border.
Not Sarasota Bay though, Dave.
No, not Sarasota Bay.
Well,
we're thinking about Palmasola because we love that place.
Yeah. No. You guys pick up the prettiest parts of Sarasota Bay. Anna Maria Sound is in Tampa Bay. No, it's not. But, one thing I think that really, makes the case for that as well is just, you have a CCMP for St. Joseph Sound, Clearwater Harbor that was based upon the approach for Tampa Bay. It was done a couple of years ago. So you already have an awful lot of work done in those two areas. I have no opinion though, except give us back Anna Maria Sound.
Well, I will be creating, formal avenues for feedback here, but I wanted to make sure that I brought this before you today because at our February board meeting, we'll be initiating some of those conversations. So if there was some sort of shared sentiment that the TAC wanted to communicate, this would be your opportunity to get that before our board meetings in February.
Maya, hey Maya, I don't know if you can hear me.
I can, Chris.
Yeah, I think I agree with Dave. I think it's a good idea to consider, looping those areas on the west side of Pinellas in as well for several reasons. But I would support that, and I think the district will probably support that as well. And the risk of creating NEP wars. We might want to take a look at Anna Maria, Palmasola Bay. It does that area there. Maybe we can talk a little bit more at some point about where should that boundary lie, because it's really more or less an artificial boundary, but one that needs to be there nonetheless. So, but just specifically to the Pinellas question that you asked, I would support that. I think that's a good idea. Now, I did have a follow-up question though. So you said parts of the Gulf of Mexico. What were you thinking in terms of the Gulf itself?
I don't necessarily have strong feelings, but I know that our representatives from Pasco County during that strategic planning process were very interested in including the Gulf waters along Pasco County. So what that looks like, it could look several different ways. We haven't formulated a staff recommendation or anything like that. So it could be all of the Gulf of Mexico waters along the Pasco County coast. It could just be the Anclote River watershed, which does include part of the Gulf of Mexico and Pasco County as well. So we would be open, to discussion. That's kind of the kinds of things we're looking to discuss over the course of the next couple months.
Yeah, that would be an interesting discussion to have as far as, because that's the area where we kind of have that dividing line between the Springs Coast and the Sun Coast. Anclote kind of is that transition from Clearwater Harbor, St. Joseph Sound. Ecologically, though, I mean, you're really from Anclote north, you're starting to kind of go into that Big Bend seagrass area. So from a habitat standpoint, where do you draw the line to say, okay, this is part of, the Tampa Bay Estuary Program, and really there's the Nature Coast Aquatic Preserve now, but other than that, like we don't have an NEP to represent the Springs Coast or really the Big Bend area. But that, yeah, I don't know. I'd have to think about that one a little bit more.
I think that, Chris's comment is sort of like what mine would be. North of Anclote Key, you shift to a very different type of system, and even monitoring seagrasses, south of Anclote Key, the grasses grow, behind a barrier island, and north of there, they can grow like 20 miles offshore, and it's a very different type of system to monitor.
Yeah.
The NEP would be great there, but it's not a seamless area of expanding your geography. Now it's a very different type of system.
Yeah, I would agree, Dave. The characteristics of the habitat change, the geology changes, and you would have a harder time drawing a line, and before you know it, Tampa Bay Estuary Program, could encompass the entire Springs Coast, which it may not be a bad thing, but
we're not advocating for that.
Yeah, and I think you also switched to a phosphorus limited system, if I remember correctly. So it's just a whole lot of differences north of Anclote Key. Not unsurmountable, but it's just very different.
Peter, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, that wasn't me. I mean, it was obnoxious enough the first time.
Hello. So, hi, this is Natasha. I don't know if anybody else from Pinellas County is on, but I know we've kind of been thinking about this outreach as a peninsula. Sorry, I swear that's not my feedback.
I can see where it is.
So I guess part of my question or comment for that decision is, from the intercoastal perspective, can we say that, the St. Joe Clearwater Harbor area is not impacting Tampa Bay, with hydrology or whatnot? Yes, we got the Narrows in there, but I think historically and where the boundary was set was to say that, Boca Ciega Bay was the main impact on Tampa Bay. So I think a big question, and, what us in Pinellas have, been beseeching is, can we really say that what's happening in that area south of Anclote is not part of Tampa Bay? And I think that's the main reason for the discussion. And also just, continuous, there's a little bit of policy and bureaucracy in that as well, but I don't know if anybody has further information on that. I do not, unfortunately, have substantial evidence that says yes or no, but that might be an important part of the conversation as well.
I think hydrologically, you're correct, Natasha. I don't think those systems north of the Narrows are impactful towards water quality wise towards the Tampa Bay estuary. The only connection perhaps for Anclote South is related to bay scallop recruitment into Tampa Bay, and those are sort of the biological connections that we can make with some of the areas that are being considered by our management and policy board members for inclusion into our program boundary.
Yeah, and Ed, that's one way to think about this. I think that does make sense, not from a hydrologic or a connectivity standpoint, but from a habitat type standpoint. Like, when you go up into Clearwater Harbor, St. Joseph Sound, similar to what you see in Boca Ciega Bay until, you get up north of Anclote, where, like Dave and I were just discussing, it starts to change. So from a habitat standpoint, the seagrass and the habitat itself probably functions similarly in those areas of Clearwater Harbor, St. Joseph Sound to what you might see down in Fort DeSoto versus what you might see off of Hernando County in Chassahowitzka or Homosassa.
Yeah.
Hey, Maya, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Mark.
I'm going to echo the great minds of many of those folks on the call, but certainly Dave and Chris as well. And it's my professional experience that, in working along the Florida Gulf Coast, it does seem to me the seagrass habitats are slightly different north of the Anclote Keys area. And to me, that's more, I think, ecologically tied to the Nature Coast or the Springs Coast, if you will. What's interesting is I'm reviewing a mitigation bank project that had proposed seagrass mitigation bank that had proposed going further north. And for those same reasons, we feel that the service area for the bank wouldn't be appropriate for that. But it's related, I think, ecologically to the types of seagrasses that you have within Tampa Bay. So that's my opinion, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you. We appreciate your feedback. I don't see anyone else unmuting, and so I'm just going to move along. We've talked a little bit about the Old Tampa Bay Actionable Science Grant. I think that many of you have participated in those calls, but essentially that's our effort to put together a research plan to begin to really address and to identify what kinds of work is needed to advance particular management actions to improve the Old Tampa Bay segment. So we're specifically looking at what do we need to know more about shellfish to potentially remediate pyridinium, or what do we need to know about circulation and hydrology to make causeway modifications or flood control structure modifications for the benefit of improving chlorophyll A conditions in Old Tampa Bay. So as part of that research grant, we're charged with co-producing a research plan with resource managers. So that means you all. And so the first part of our approach to that is to make sure that everyone really does understand the science behind the challenges in Old Tampa Bay and about pyridinium specifically as a management challenge for addressing chlorophyll A concentrations in Old Tampa Bay. And so there's a link to our first attempt at a research synthesis about pyridinium. We're requesting that our TAC members and our Nitrogen Management Consortium members review that document and provide any comments to Carrie Lopez at FWC. That notice also went out in the TAC blast in December, but I'm linking it here again because I don't believe we've received any comments to date, and it might have gotten lost in the holiday shuffle. So again, as being members of our TAC, one of the things that you all committed to in the roles and responsibilities is that you would review these kinds of documents and provide your feedback. So we would really appreciate a little bit of your time to do that. And then I had a few quick announcements that I just wanted to share with everyone. The first is that the Tampa Bay Environmental Restoration Fund request for proposals is live now. Proposals will be due March 11th. So the link to the RFP and our website is available again in the agenda here. You'll notice that the funding amounts are potentially a little bit higher than usual, and that's because Congress passed the bipartisan infrastructure law. As a result of the passage of that law, the NEPs throughout the country will be receiving an additional $900,000 each year for 5 years. And so we're looking, considering different ways that we can spend that money for the benefit of Tampa Bay. So I did just want to make sure you all are aware of that bipartisan infrastructure law. You can click on the link in the agenda to learn a little bit more about it. But essentially, those that law and the NEP funding is prioritizing projects that do things that address, sort of our bread and butter, water quality kinds of concerns, nutrient load reduction projects. Projects that address climate change, projects that address environmental justice, and invest in communities that perhaps have been underinvested in. And then finally, the idea is that all of these kinds of projects will also make sure that the economy is strong, equitable, and supporting the environment as well. And then finally, the Tampa Bay Estuary Program, we're hiring. We have a position open right now for a project implementation specialist, and the link to that job description and how to apply is included in the agenda. So please check it out and share it with folks that you think might be interested. We're a pretty fun crew to work with, and we would love to have somebody else who's fun join our team. Gary, did you want to give a plug for BASIS?
Absolutely. Thanks, Maya. We are holding BASIS starting on Monday through Friday, February 28th through March 4th. It is going to be primarily in person. There will be a minimal virtual option. Registration costs will be the same either way. We're looking forward to a really robust schedule. Workshops on Monday, sessions Tuesday through Friday. And again, this is a combined 5-year or 6-year basis plus an association and national estuary programs tech transfer meeting. So downtown St. Petersburg at the Bayfront Hilton. Looking forward to seeing as many people in person as possible. The registration information is linked there as well. Looking forward to seeing you.
And if Chris A is still on, this is Marcus. Call me about the BASIS workshops, please.
Will do.
Does anyone else have any announcements or things they want to share?
Yeah, Maya, just a real quick update for the group with respect to our 2022 seagrass mapping. We are about 92% complete with our aerial acquisition for the Suncoast. That's Clearwater Harbor, St. Joe Sound, Tampa Bay South to Charlotte Harbor. We expect, if all goes well, we could be finished with all our acquisition this week. We actually have the plane here this week and should be flying right now. So if you see them, wave at them and wish them well. So that's where we are right now with our acquisition. So we should be complete here very soon. And we've already started our field verification, data collection, and as soon as the imagery are post-processed, then we'll start rolling into the photo interpretation.
Thanks for that update, Chris. We're all waiting with bated breath. Anyone else? All right. Well, then thanks for joining us for the first TAC meeting in 2022. Look forward to seeing y'all later. Have a good one.
Thanks, Maya.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.